because they knew that the things that they'd invested in were so integral to our economy that they would have been forced to be bailed out by the government. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy from the start. Turns out, right? New Labour fucking sucked. There's very little to be able to put between, outside of austerity politics, between what's being said here and what the Conservatives have given us in government for the last 12 years. Now, I saw this article on Twitter, and I was pretty taken aback when I first saw it, because the title is about how politics has lurched left in the last 25 years, which I find an incredibly weird statement, considering that, we've just had continual privatization, continual, demonization of migrants, for example. We've got the Trojan horse affair, we've had, the anti-trans panic, all that kind of stuff. In general, our economy is far more right-wing than ever has been. There's just... workers are continually having their contracts ripped up and replaced with poor ones, 0-hour contracts, all that kind of stuff, right? It feels like we're lurching even further towards, the most kind of, market fundamentalist economy this country has basically ever had. So for this article to be titled that politics has lurched left, I find very, very strange. But I think this article is really illuminating about a lot of conservative ideology, and also it's Daniel Hannan. And he makes a lot of really interesting points about New Labour that I think are actually pretty salient. He makes salient points about New Labour, about how right-wing they were. But he thinks that it's a good thing, and I obviously think that it's a very bad thing, because you're right, I don't like right-wing politics. That's why I don't like Blair, and I don't like New Labour as a political force, right? So let's have a look and view it, because Daniel Hannan is, of course, an incredibly erudite journalist. So let's have a look. What Blair promised in the 1990s was sounder than anything the Tories would dare say now. Politics has lurched to the left in the past 25 years. COVID, the 2008 crash, social media, and the right's loss of self-belief are to blame. There is a usually seductive logic to any new regulation, the Prime Minister told his think tank audience. There was almost a case that can be made for each specific instrument. Problem is cumulative. All these good intentions can add up to one large expense with suffocating effects. Hurrah, you might think, at last a PM who understands that Britain's underperformance stems from excessive government. The excessive government where everything's been privatised? That doesn't make much sense to me, but you do you, Daniel. The trouble is that that year was 2005 and the PM was Tony Blair. I mean, to be fair to the article, right? Tony Blair was the one who was doing PFIs. Tony Blair was the one who privatised HS1, right? Tony Blair was very happy for the private sector to get involved in government, and didn't fix any of the issues that we had with financial deregulation that led to the 2008 financial crash. So Daniel Hannan is right, but he's wrong about why he's right. He thinks that this is a good thing, what New Labour were doing, and obviously it wasn't good. It led to a bunch of the issues that we have now. I have a really good video about the failure of the Blair administration. I should talk a lot on this channel about the failure of the Blair administration, because I think it's worth talking about, right? Insofar as people just think, it's the Labour Party, so they must be left-wing. And I'm just like, no. They're like, the Blairites were, neoliberal entrists into the Labour Party that changed it away from its roots. We could have had, maybe even a third way, very, very slightly sock them party if Neil Kinnock had won in 92, or if John Smith hadn't popped his clogs, right? But no, we had Blair and we had neoliberalism, and it was bad, right? There were loads of bad things that happened, but I don't know why that Daniel Hannan seems to think that it was good that all of this stuff happened and it led to the problems that we have now. But anyway, we'll get into it whilst I go through the article. The sun-tanned freebie-meister did not pull his punches. Something is seriously awry when teachers feel unable to take children on school trips for fear of being sued, when the FSA is seen as a hugely inhibiting of efficient business by perfectly respectable companies that have never defrauded anybody, when pensions protection inflates dramatically the cost of selling pensions to middle-income people. How can the centre of gravity have been pulled so far left since? That's the issue, right? How is it any more left-wing than this? This is just what we've had, de facto, right? There's very little to be able to put between, outside of austerity politics, between what's being said here and what the Conservatives have given us in government for the last 12 years. Now, the Prime Minister was Campbell and Mandelson. 100%, Tyler G, you're absolutely right. As you say so, as soon as I read this line, we are all Thatcherites now, declared Peter Mandelson in 2002, adding cheerfully that globalization punishes hard any country that tries to run its economy by ignoring the realities of the market. When, following the 2009 crash, the then Chancellor Alistair Darling was asked whether he proposed spending cuts would match Margaret Thatcher's, he replied, "They will be deeper and tougher." Turns out, right? New Labour fucking sucked. And both the New Labour and the Conservatives had exactly the wrong response to the financial crash, in that the following recession should have been followed by a fiscal expansion. That's what we should have done. That's what they did in Australia. Kevin Rudd just gave out economic stimulus in checks to certain sectors of the country to try and get them spending again, to try and keep the economy going. That's what we should have done in the wake of the recession. And that's what Australia did, and that's why they had the best result coming out of the global financial crisis, right? This is the same nonsense economics that underpins what Daniel Hannan believes in, and what underpins what New Labour believed in, and what underpins what George Osborne believed in. Is just thoroughly nonsensical. It makes no fucking sense. It was, again, not economically rational. It was not. It was not pragmatic. It was not what they would call themselves fiscally responsible, because it led to a worse economy, and that's why we've had so much wage stagnation and economic stagnation and low growth over the last 12 years, because austerity was a con, just like Alistair Darling was bad to do deep cuts, as he's saying there. He was also bad when George Osborne did even further cuts with the Conservative government of 2010 to 2015. It was all bad, right? Again, done another good video on that. Why the Tories are not the the party of sound economics. You should definitely watch that one as well. Yeah, there's not even a centre now. It's just different flavours of right wing. How different the mood is today. Having raised public spending on a supposedly emergency basis during the pandemic, you find that it's politically impossible to return to the levels of February 2020. Taxes must go up instead. Well, that's because the circumstances have changed, right? Like, we've always had, I mean, not only, to be fair, have lots of these public bodies expense sheets gone up because they're having to pay for PFI debt, thank you, Blair, but also because, changing demographics, the way our society is run, the fact that the cutting away of the state has affected people's health in other ways, rather than, keeping people in good working conditions, in good, healthy conditions through, the ability for there to be some kind of socially based market. No, neoliberalism screwed all of that. And now people are worse off because of it, and the NHS, and because people are getting older, the NHS just needs more money. It's as simple as that, right? This is an identical paradigm to what we had before, just the circumstances have changed. And the thing is that this next, again, when Kwasi Kwarteng proposed returning the top rate of tax to where it had been throughout the Blair years, Tory MPs scattered in panic. Blair, by contrast, argued that without embarrassment, that higher rates meant lower revenues. Pressed by Jeremy Paxton about the impact on inequality, answered, "It's not a burning ambition for me to make sure that David Beckham earns less money." When this is just bad. It's identical. This is just identical politics between these two people, right? He's right that New Labour are right wing. He is right about them. But that doesn't make what they're saying good. Because we've seen over the past 12 years, past fucking 43 years at this point, that none of this shit works. None of it works. They've always used, and all of these governments have used government intervention, right? To differing degrees, and then it just gets covered up in the details. Britain's leftward lurch is not just economic. On public services, benefits, immigration, even the legacy of empire, today's ministers will not dream of talking as their predecessors did 15 years ago. Now, this is something that I do think is true. I do think that on a lot of social issues, we have moved further, more progressive on these social issues over time, right? I don't think that the Conservative Party membership have done that. But the Conservative Party are smart enough to know that if they suddenly... Thank you for the follow, Rare Cup. I appreciate it. Welcome to No Justice Stream. I hope you're doing well. But, they understand that if they suddenly started coming out, I don't know, against abortion, right? Or pro-racism, etc., then they would get castigated by the public so much so they wouldn't get elected at the next general election, even worse than they are now. But also, immigration is not necessarily a right or left-wing issue. For example, if you're a right-winger and you just care about, for example, economic growth, you just want more immigration because it's good for economic growth, right? even if you fully believe that you can use it to undercut native-born workers or whatever, even that's not true. But if you genuinely believe that that was true, you wouldn't care, because your market fundamentalism would say, well, we fully believe that people should be able to compete in the market as much as possible, and erecting rudimentary barriers in the form of borders to be able to do that isn't in the interest of corporations who want to be able to ensure that markets are as unimpeded as possible. And that's what, immigration restrictions are. It's impeding the ability of the market to function in the way that it should. You are making unnecessary barriers to market competition, right? Now, again, as a pragmatist, and seeing that there are no negative externalities to immigration, at least on the part of, for example, wages, for people on the lower ends of the spectrum. When you look at the work of, say, for example, David Card or Mariana Mazzucato, all these kind of people we have natural studies, natural experiments showing that this isn't the case. That immigrants drive down wages because they just don't. And even some of the natural experiments that have shown some negative impacts on native-born workers, the impact is incredibly small, and also gets offset by the increased tax revenue that can theoretically go into public services, and also the economic growth that benefits everybody regardless. Even if their own take-home pay is lower, the fact that economic growth allows us to be able to put more money into better public services meant that overall their quality of life improves as well, especially when their purchasing power was already low if they're on the bottom end of the income scale. So, immigration isn't necessarily a right or left-wing issue. It's just for some people it's a racist issue. I hate to put it that way, but a lot of people, they just don't want brown people in the country. As simple as that. Is that right-wing? I mean, probably. But I would say that there being less racism is just a net good, whether it's left or right-wing. I don't know. Like, if you're going to stake your claim that to be right-wing you have to be racist, then, maybe that's a you problem, Daniel. The Conservative approach to NHS is to sing its praises and sign its bills, apart from the fact where they've privatised loads of it during the pandemic. And they also are at war with doctors and nurses. True, Blair brought private providers into the system, except that's just what Blair was just continuing from John Major, and then all that stuff was continued by Osborne, and then Hammond, and then Sunak. And now Jeremy Hunt, right? The level of private provision has only increased under literally every administration for the last 43 years. There's been no change on this. Just because Wes Streeting is talking about overall reform, despite the fact that it's not even politically convenient to do so, because people don't want reform. They want the NHS to stay as it is. This is just not a true statement that they just signed the bills of the NHS. The Tories also engage in additional private provision. Everyone's doing it. Both of the main parties in our country just want more private provision in the NHS, and have been doing so for the past 43 years, apart from a very, very small moment when Jeremy Corbyn advocated for removal of all private provision from the NHS. That's the only difference between the two parties on this issue. And both incredibly right-wing. It's just not left-wing at all. Actually, people's opinions on the NHS have become more left-wing over time, which I find very interesting. By 2008, we could have as much as 40% of acute operations done in the private sector being done under the NHS banner, he told health chiefs. Then that target was not reached largely due to what was then his health secretary, John Reid, frankly called a culture of resistance. Again, you're not saying that things have moved leftward. All you're just doing is claiming, and correctly, that Blair was right-wing, which he was. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff here about policies that New Labour did that were just right-wing, and I could go over all of them, but I do just agree on all of his prescriptions here, right? Or descriptions, even rather, that what New Labour were doing and proposing, at least optically, whether or not they actually went through with the legislation at all, was indeed right-wing in some sense. And those are correct prescriptions that he's made here. That's why it's such a weird article, because it's kind of half correct and half just completely fucking wrong. Maybe a lot of people's opinions in this country have moved leftwards, and he does allude as to why. So we'll go down to there, right? How are we to explain Britain's leftward lurch, almost all of it under Tory rule? Well, mainly because Tories are crap at governing and have impoverished everybody, so people are more likely to be able to gain some kind of class consciousness and move leftward. Part of the answer is that Blair never intended to do half the things that he promised. Fair. I mean, if you believe that if he is as right-wing as he has been claimed in this article, which I agree, he is very right-wing, right? If he didn't do it, that'd be more left-wing than he was claiming. not an unreasonable assertion to be able to make, for example. And again, talking about foundation hospitals, tuition fees, and replacement of student grants with loans, for example, these are all right-wing reforms. Yeah, Blair was right-wing. Like, he's made that claim, for example. Don't need to go over that anymore during this article here. So what changed? First, the collapse of the banks in 2008, or more precisely, the bailouts decreed in response destroyed the consensus behind capitalism. Now, this sentence here is the worst one in this whole article, because I have pre-read it, unfortunately. I'm sorry, guys. It's not a first-time reaction. But it's both, right? It's both of these things. Because the big issue is that capitalism brought us the collapse of the banks in 2008. Rampant greed with no regulation led to the point where people were using far too much leverage to be able to invest in subprime mortgages. That meant that all of the fucking rotten trees that were the part of the backbone of our economy all fell to pieces, right? That was the fault of capitalism. The bailouts were also the fault of capitalism because we had marketized, due to neoliberal economics, so many parts of our economy that were central to its functioning. Like, I don't know, fucking housing, right? Which we'll get onto later. And that housing was such an integral part of how our economy functioned because everyone needs a place to live, right? Regardless of what economic system that you're in, whether it's capitalist, socialist, feudalist, primitive, communist, or whatever. Everyone needs a fucking house. We need a house. Shelter is one of the basic things that you need to exist, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, 101, for example. And because we'd marketized so much of it, we'd left them beholden to the market and, unfettered capitalism. By the time capitalism collapsed under its own weight due to lack of regulation and because we'd made so many free market reforms to how our financial system worked, for example, when the trees suddenly collapsed, when the rotten trees collapsed because of failures and their overall greed and because they'd used too much leverage because of under-regulation, the government was forced to bail them out. Because if they'd not bailed them out, people wouldn't have had fucking anywhere to live. Because the externalities of the failure of capitalism would have been bad for everybody. So they had to engage in bailouts. I mean, they shouldn't have. Actually, what they should have done is nationalizations rather than bailouts, but I digress. Even so, the reason why the bailouts happened is because we had over-marketized things which were integral to the function of our society, right? And that's why they knew that they could engage in these highly leveraged gambles, essentially, because they knew that the things that they'd invested in were so integral to our economy that they would have been forced to be bailed out by the government. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy from the start, the whole of the financial crash. Because you can't just as an electoral force, just allow swathes of people to go onto the streets without there being a violent revolution. And so to save capitalism, they had to use the power of the state to bail out the banks. It's simple, right? To say that, the state intervening on behalf of the market failure is antithetical to capitalism, I'm just like, well, unfortunately, anyone who's studied any amount of capitalism will know that capitalism and the state are just intrinsically linked. There has never been a capitalist country that's existed without the state to be able to maintain contract law, for example, or to run the emergency services. And there's been a privatized police force, for example, or the idea of like a bunch of company towns with private army is like some weird fucking Bioshock dystopia that will never fucking happen. And so the Marxist argument that the free market was a sham, a way for the rich to stay rich, suddenly was vindicated. Not seemed vindicated, Daniel. It was vindicated. It was completely vindicated. As ordinary taxpayers were forced to rescue wealthy bankers from the consequences of their own mistakes. But it's exactly the reason why under-regulation and belief in the free market and the over-marketization of things that are integral to running our society was why this all failed. Marxism didn't seem to be vindicated. It just instantly was vindicated overnight. We all knew. It was obvious. Marx predicted this shit decades ago. Centuries ago. Sorry. A little bit, factors of 10 wrong time frame there, but regardless, right? It was obvious to anybody. And that's why people at the time were betting against the synthetic success of the market. People were betting that this was going to happen. And they didn't want to stop it because they knew they'd make money out of it. And the internal incentive structures of capitalism led to both of those things happening in the first place. Both the people who wanted to gamble on the market to make loads of money at the expense of, parts of our society that we couldn't do without, and was also why people wanted to bet against that. Specifically, they wanted to bet that it would crash because they make a lot of money, and they didn't want to stop it because why would they? If they're going to make it rich in a world where it's everyone for themselves, neoliberal, atomized, individualized world, right? Who cares if there's negative externalities for everybody? Because I've got filthy fucking rich off of it. With enough money, you can actualise everything. Well, exactly. The only thing the British public should be doing is getting both parties out of Parliament. Neither is better than the other. I find it so hard to vote for either now, as both parties haven't got a clue. Well, 100% rare cup. I, for a very long time on this channel, I've a very, very long time on this channel, I had always maintained, for example, in the effective utility of voting to get the Tories out, for example. But at this point, Labour are so right-wing that they're just worse than the Tories. They may not be more, and they're just as corrupt and anti-democratic and authoritarian. There's just no choice between different flavours of neoliberalism now. You cannot trust Labour with the NHS, for example, under Wes Streeting. You cannot trust them to be not authoritarian, considering what they've done on their internal party democracy. They are ceding every single narrative to the neoliberals, to the racists, for example. Even whilst being 26 points ahead in the polls. Right? They have a golden opportunity to change the narrative, right? In the wake of what's happening after, the issues with the pandemic, and they're just taking the opportunity and putting it in the fucking trash. So at this point, no, I don't want to vote Labour anymore. It's so fucking sad. If the candidate who stood as MP in our local constituency, lovely guy, really like him, Corbynite, socialist, loved, really great policy platform. Whether he'll be the candidate again, I don't know. The long list hasn't even been done for Broxtowe yet. But I'm assuming if he did try to get the position, he would just get blocked by the Labour Party again, right? I find it really difficult to want to vote for them. I just want to vote Green. I just want to vote for the Green Party. Even with all the transphobia, because you get transphobia in every fucking party now. The country definitely needs Ali G back. It needs more RESTECP. Yeah, thing is, Tyler, that's part of Streeting. The problem with Streeting, right, is that because he looks like a fucking 12-year-old, people don't take him seriously for the absolute fucking snake oil salesman that he is, the absolute duplicitous piece of shit that he is, right? He's incredibly conniving and devious. And because he looks like, he's just come out of primary school, people won't properly scrutinize the things that he says and does. And that's not good. Like previously, maybe my prescription should really be that you should vote for Labour MPs in your constituency if you feel that they are substantially left-wing enough to hold Keir Starmer to account when it comes to votes in the Commons, to be able to vote down legislation if the majority in Parliament means he needs to rely on the SCG for votes. He's like a charming Gavin Williamson. Well, exactly. So if your vote for Labour is to put in another SCG member, for example, then I think you should do that. In that you should vote for them because, if they're the last MP that gets Starmer over the line to being Prime Minister, then he's got to rely on that person's vote. And if they're left-wing enough to vote against Starmer, then your vote's been a utilitarian good. But we'll cover that at a different time. Never mind that subsidies, bailouts, and nationalisations are not free market policies. But then I understand, Daniel, they are not free market policies, but they were necessary policies if you want to not lose the next election, right? They're necessary policies if you don't want people out on the streets, with torches and pitchforks. The myth got about that the crash had been caused by deregulation, even though with the exception of nuclear power, we would have struggled to find a more heavily regulated sector than financial services. He doesn't make any claim for the actual cause, right? Or make any assertions as to why it was highly regulated when it was literally the fact that it wasn't regulated enough on capital risks that led to the subprime mortgage crisis in the fucking first place. So I'm a market socialist, Rare Cup. So I believe in worker democracy and mutualist institutions. Um, I believe in local democracy. I believe in devolution. I believe in local politics. I believe in. Uh, I don't like landlords very much. Um, I skeptical of like centralized economies. For example, I think that command economies only really work on very small scales. So if you look at places like the Seychelles, they had a pretty good command economy. But when you look at, for example, the People's Republic of China, that's where you see the negative externalities of large scale planned economies coming in. We look what happened with the whole fucking pig iron shit during the Great Leap Forward, and how literally the biggest humanitarian disaster in human history, right, was caused just by a centralized planned economy not knowing what the fuck they were doing. So it has to be on a small scale. So that's a lot of my my political prescriptions, right? And overall, the kind of local, more democrat, a big believer, like axiomatically, in democracy as a first principle, right? So more democracy is good as far as I'm concerned. If that makes sense, rack up. But yeah, like, just because you're highly regulated doesn't mean it was regulated enough. Well, exactly, Jim speak. Like, literally, if they'd have regulated the amount of capital risks that went into the subprime mortgage crisis, we could have avoided the financial crash. But of course, that didn't happen because they weren't regulated enough. Simple. People see Streeting as Charlie Bucket from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but we know that he's really Damien from The Omen. It's so true. It's so true. Second, the years after 2012 saw the spread of social media and, in consequence, the surge in identity politics, the Great Awakening. Ministers in the Labour government did not need to worry about being piranha-shoaled when they ever said anything controversial. Today, MPs in all parties are cowed by their woken vigilators. Things go unsaid. As the years pass and the silence reinforces the taboo, they eventually go unthought. Again, you didn't have any evidence or any examples for any of this stuff. Just that people are becoming more kind of socially progressive, I guess. Which is, I mean, that's just, I mean, Daniel Hannan fancies himself a libertarian, so I'm not sure where he's going with that particular comment. We disagree on a lot, which is good. Not very often you see a British streamer talk about British issues. Well, exactly, yeah. I think I found my niche, to be fair, in being a British streamer who talks solely about British politics. But again, the problem when you talk about woke issues, for example. Hey, thank you for the subscription, Rare Cup with Prime. Much appreciated. Thank you very much. You're right, Jacob. How you doing in chat? Welcome to the Injustice stream. Hope you're doing well. Whenever any politician or any public figure talks about wokeism, for example, the Great Awakening, they can never define it. They never define what they mean by quote unquote wokeness, for example. I mean, I said at the start of this segment, to be fair, that there is probably a bit of more of a kind of leftward shift on social policy, for example, at least amongst the electorate. May not be amongst what the actual policy that gets passed, though. Maybe that's where a lot of this issue with this article is, that it seems to be thinking that overall people's new principles that they talk about, for example, in common discussion, for example, the way the public actually thinks may be more left wing than it used to be, and possibly is the case, especially given the results of the economic crisis. But that's not reflected in political policy. It's not been reflected in governance. It's not been reflected in anything that we've seen remotely in regard to actual policy from the government over the last 12 years. Third, the lockdowns made voters more collectivist, more authoritarian, more demanding of state intervention. I mean, if you're by that you mean what I was saying earlier, and the pandemic made us realize that the people who do all the work in society are super fucking important and societally useful, and you can't really put a price on things that they do because they are necessary for the function of society, then sure, maybe that made us more collectivist when we collectively realised that maybe nurses and cleaners and shop retail staff and all the people who risked their lives during the pandemic, maybe they're more important than just the marginal value that they provide to employers. Maybe that's the case. Fourth, there are no permanent victories in politics. Blair came to power when the fall of the Berlin Wall was recent memory. Socialism has failed in the most public and palpable way, and he knew he had to distance himself from its nostrums. But the ideal of the rotten ideology comes back in each generation because its falsehoods chime more naturally with the Stone Age intuitions of a tribal species than do the truths of liberal capitalism. Apart from the fact that literally, we saw the failures of liberal capitalism all of this time. Right? We're living through continual economic crises, continual crises of neoliberalism specifically, right? If you want to save capitalism, Daniel, if you really, really want to save capitalism, then you need look no further than the Nordic countries, right? Social democratic mixed economy capitalism, where they use the power of the state and state intervention to be able to control the issues that arise from, the externalities of the free market, right? Like, there have been so many articles I've seen from wealthy capitalists saying that there needs to be some form of redistributive policy if you want to be able to save capitalism. Because if it continues getting more and more unequal, like we're seeing in the United States and the UK, like the Gini coefficient of these countries is fucking it's the lowest of the low when you look at the when you look globally, for example, at economically developed countries, the Gini coefficients of the UK and the US are drastically lower in comparison to all the rest of the countries, and that leads to societal instability, right? It leads to societal dysfunction. It leads to the breeding grounds for the nature of populist rhetoric, whether that be on the left or the right. For example, capitalism and decay, what have you. The people's economic woes that have come from 43 years of unfettered neoliberalism have led to the societal breakdowns that have led to the breeding grounds for things like the BNP and the EDL, especially when there's been no proper left-wing alternative, as has been stated in this particular article about how right-wing the Blair administration was and how they tried to court liberal voters rather than energizing their base to be able to get out there and vote as well, or changing the narrative. Like, we had right-wing neoliberalism as the de facto ideology for 43 years, and people are turning against it because of the issues that it's given us. You like capitalism, but you admit that it punishes people who don't have money as the first thing on their mind. I mean, if you believe, I think there are a lot of capitalists who you agree with my statement that I made previously, in that social democratic capitalism is the best way of saving capitalism, right? Or third way, social market capitalism is, people like Gordon Brown would support, for example. But I also believe it can be better. I believe it can be better, and that's why I like worker democracy, for example. That's why I like mutualist institutions. Like, these things worked before the 1980s, right? We had all these mutual institutions that then got destroyed by the Thatcher administration, and we were worse off because of it, right? Like, the post-war consensus is better than what we have now. I mean, I say in my Twitter bio that I'm a leftist streamer and a neoliberalism hater. Like, I don't necessarily hate social democracy, as even though it's capitalist, I'm an anti-capitalist, I still view social democracy as better than neoliberalism. So, and as a utilitarian, I'd be like, sure, if we're going to replace neoliberalism with social democracy, things have gotten better at least, right? I'm not going to complain about things getting better. Finally, and following on from this last, free marketeers must educate each generation precisely because their creed is counterintuitive and also wrong when you actually look at any of the data on these issues. For example, I did a TikTok about responding to somebody on minimum wage, for example, where I was Jess Gill, of course it was, saying that you can't increase the minimum wage is bad because an increase in minimum wage necessarily leads to higher unemployment, despite the fact the minimum wage has continued to increase and we're now at record low unemployment, for example, since 1978 or whatever it is. I think we're at the lowest level of unemployment since Callahan was Prime Minister, for example, even though minimum wages continued to go up in that time, for example. But even so, right, there's this kind of economic dogmatism that underpins a lot of neoliberal ideology because they believe in praxeology. A lot of these people, especially the libertarian types, the capitalist, the people who worship the market like a religion, they believe in praxeology, which is the denial of empiricism and the belief that every single human is a rational actor that makes purposeful behavior rather than reflexive behavior, which is not borne out by any of the data. But then again, they don't want to look at the data. When you look at all of the literature that we have, for example, over the last kind of 20, 30 years of study on the minimum wage, it will show you that there is, even if there is slight negative elasticity in regards to overall employment with minimum wage increases, for example, that gets offset by the increase in purchasing power of the people who get paid. So there is net positive utility to be able to be doing that. But the issue is that these people, like the free marketeers, they are too busy thinking I mean, as a physicist, right, I know about people who make ridiculous assumptions about, frictionless balls in a vacuum. Nickel, not with a follow on Twitch. Thank you very much for the follow. Welcome to the Justice stream. I hope you're doing well. In that they take a lot of truths about economics to be self-evident, when even if they may make intuitive sense, ironically, considering he says it's counterintuitive, when you actually look at the way that they work out in practice, that's not the case. Like, literally, the Nobel Prize was won in 2009 by someone showing that the tragedy of the commons wasn't correct, which underpins so much of liberal capitalist economics and free market economics, right? For example, and when you look at the studies that have gone into things like the minimum wage, things like inflation, like literally quantity theory of money does not get taught anymore in economic institutions nowadays. But we still get people in common parlance every single fucking time there's an inflationary period who think that the only thing that causes inflation is fiscal expansion, when we just have there's no evidence to support this shit, right? Japan's debt to GDP ratio is like fucking 250%. They've been waiting 30 years for their inflationary period, right? Like, there's just no sense in quantity theory of money as a theory of inflation. Yet it pervades political discourse forever. And free marketers have so much power with regards to this economic doctrine. Because it's almost like a bunch of economic policies that favour the rich over everybody else are then going to be funded and given undue prominence by people who have the necessary resources to be able to promote them. Which turns out the necessary resource under capitalism to promote your ideology is money. So it's self-perpetuating. Fucking cultural hegemony. Well, Gramsci was right, as always, because he always of course he's right. It's nothing personal, just business, they say, whilst ruining people's actual lives. How could it get me more personal to ruin someone whose life for money? Well, exactly. Again, they don't want to look at the negative externalities. They fundamentally believe religiously in the dogma of the free market, and they refuse to look at evidence that contradicts them. Even when you stare it in the face. I got into someone was arguing in my TikTok comments, just saying, well, you can just produce studies to say whatever you want, but we all know, anyone who knows a thing about economics, it's economics 101. If you increase the minimum wage, you increase unemployment. I'm like, show me evidence that that's how that works in the real world, right? Like, I've got a fucking physics degree. Like, I know about that. You need to actually show me these things to be replicable in real life rather than just theoretical, for you to be able to create that some kind of economic proof. The whole point of scientific stuff, again, it also comes back down to this idea that economics is somehow a hard science rather than a soft science, when really it's kind of both. Like you can use econometrics to make statistical predictions to be able to influence governmental policy all you want. I think that's a good thing, but a lot of stuff in economics is just fucking vibes. We live in a vibes-based economy. Like, businesses will raise their prices and increase CPI based on the vibes they have about what future inflationary pressures might be. For example, CPI is just a measure that people at central institutions have decided makes up an average shopping basket, which turned out made no actual sense when it came to people on the bottom of the breadline, for example, because Jack Monroe went to them and said, actually, when you look at the way you've calculated the CPI, it disadvantages people who spend money on lower priced goods. And they were like, oh yeah, you got us, we'll change that and we'll create the Vimes Boots Index. Like, it's just fucking vibes. It's just fucking vibes. All of it. Not all of it, but a lot of economics is vibes, and it's not the hard science that the monetarists like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek and Wilhelm Röpke would tell you that it was. Like, and again, but the problem is that creating a bunch of simple rules that you can just follow to be good at economics, like you would if it was a hard science, makes it palatable for people who want simple answers to complex problems. It's the same reason why, conservatives are more likely to have high levels of religiosity, because that's what religion gives you, simple answers to complex problems. And that's why they want economics to be treated like a religion rather than an incredibly complex subject that it is. It's easier to say pay our NHS heroes more than to ask where the money is coming from. I mean, the central bank, like all fiat currency, this is just basic economics that he just doesn't even realise isn't correct. Because again, monetarists still want to understand the change of an economy in a modern world, right? Like, that's not how money works in a modern world. Like the central bank conjures money into the bank accounts to then be put through as gilt. Or in the world of digital fiat currency, the central bank will be able to make money appear in people's bank accounts. It's not printing money anymore, right? It's not like the tax money. It doesn't get put into the government's bank account that then gets paid out to be able to fund public services. That's never how economy has worked. If anything, right, the people who are oversimplifying economics to at the detriment of actual reality are monetarists, are right wingers, right? It's why this fiscal black hole shit just won't wash. It's easier to say protect our farmers than to point out that barriers to imports make everyone, including farmers, worse off. I mean, there's some truth to that, right? But then again, you just show me policy and show me the positive utility, and I'll back it. But unfortunately, the issue that we have is that, to be fair, this Daniel Hannan is someone who's pro-Brexit. So if anybody is screwing over the farmers by giving us barriers to imports, then he's the one making them worse off. But then nevertheless, I digress. And if anything, the last claim that he makes here is that it's easier to say cap energy prices than to explain that the price mechanism is what tells producers to make more of something, apart from the fact that that only applies to certain industries depending on the elasticity of the supply or the necessity of the demand, right? When the demand is inelastic, for example, like with the ability to be able to heat their homes, for example, it doesn't matter whether or not you cap the energy prices or not. They're still going to extract as much profit as possible. If anything, all this is an example of, if you want to cap prices, the best way of doing it is put the fucking government in charge. Take state control over the oil deposits. Sell it at cost to maximize utility. The reason why prices are so high is specifically because the producers refuse to maintain their capacity. Again, because they have a monopoly over the supply of these things. That doesn't matter about whether the prices are capped or not, because they're not even responding to market signals. We literally have a global cartel of oil producers. They're called fucking OPEC, who get to control global wholesale prices by being able to connive amongst each other, because there's no fucking regulation on an international scale, right? It doesn't matter whether you have price caps, it doesn't matter whether you have regulation. OPEC will get around it because they've cartelized, because things have been over-marketized. The increase in price actually incentivized energy producers to delay increasing production. Exactly, 100%. It's what incentivized OPEC to slow down production as well. 100% JDM, you're absolutely right. Our reluctance to make those arguments has brought us to where we are, a servile nation impoverished by spending, debt, and regulation. Again, and this is the worst right-wing canard I hear all the time, is that you can't borrow your way into growth, when that is literally how every LLC functions. Every single company borrows to invest, and that's what governments do. It's good, it's fine. And regulation is fine depending on what you're regulating, right? As I said, I'm not a planned economy fundamentalist. I'm not like a, fucking, Marxist-Leninist or whatever. I believe that markets will have their utility in certain circumstances, and regulation will have its utility in certain circumstances. Anyone who's coming at you with some kind of fucking grand narrative of how regulation is always good or always bad, or markets are always good or always bad, just doesn't understand how any of this fucking stuff functions. It depends on what you're borrowing to invest in, though, as to whether or not it's good. Well, 100% rare cup. Well, exactly. For example, that's why John McDonnell was really good, in that he was saying that their red line for borrowing, as the Corbyn government would have been, their red line for borrowing was only borrowing for investment rather than borrowing for day-to-day spending, which is, good, based 100%. As long as you're generating economic growth with the money that you're borrowing and that you're spending, that growth, that money, the dividends will then pay themselves back. And that's the issue that we had coming out of the global financial crisis, is that we didn't have the overall capacity in the economy to get proper growth to grow out of the recession in 2010 to 2015, because there wasn't enough fiscal stimulus. And because the anemic growth that we had didn't increase the productive capacity of the economy enough, we still had to borrow money, and they didn't get rid of the deficit as quickly as they said they would, because economic stagnation was the fault of a lack of investment from the state, right? We borrowed quite well into growth over here after the war. Well, exactly, Tyler G. 100%. Like, again, this is the problem that we have. Like, it's really strange how he just doesn't see that, A, our economy is still very right-wing. May not be the libertarian paradise we wanted to, but it's not a social democracy that we live in or anything like that, or even third way at this point. Second of all, New Labour being incredibly right-wing, it just shows that there's just hegemonic support for neoliberal ideology and has been for 43 years, Daniel. And last of all is that any reforms we have had that have made things even left-wing have been done as a result of the failures of right-wing policy and the necessity of people to try and get elected. It's as simple as that, right? Maybe he's right about the fact that if you really want the public themselves to, as a collective, to change their ideology towards your free market one, you're going to have to sell them the benefits. But they're not seeing any of the benefits. It's all made them worse off at the end of the day. So it's a really illuminating article, because there's lots of correct things and there are lots of fundamentally incorrect things, whilst misdiagnosing problems and misdiagnosing issues. So I thought it would be really interesting for us to cover on the channel. And yeah, if you are enjoying the content on YouTube or Twitch, you can become a member on YouTube for just 99p, cheaper than a can of Red Stripe. You can become a subscriber on Twitch for $3.99. You get emotes for both of these, but you get more emotes if you subscribe on Twitch. And there's a donate link if you go into the YouTube comment, if you go into the YouTube description, or if you type !donate in Twitch chat. And if you like and subscribe on YouTube as well, that would be most appreciated too. If you're watching on Twitch, it's right, the URL is right there for you. Thank you, and I'll catch you on the next segment.